You get a text from your partner that just says, "We need to talk," and your entire nervous system goes into full panic mode. Your heart races, your hands start sweating. You feel this crushing weight in your chest like something catastrophic is about to happen, and within seconds you've convinced yourself that the relationship is over, that you've done something terribly wrong, that this is it. Then 2 hours later you find out they wanted to talk about what to have for dinner this weekend. Sound familiar? Here's what nobody tells you about rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's not just being a little sensitive. It's not about having thin skin or needing to toughen up. It's a neurological response that happens in ADHD brains where perceived rejection or criticism triggers an emotional reaction so intense and so immediate that it can completely derail your entire day, your relationships, and your sense of self-worth. And the worst part? Most people have no idea this is even happening to you because you've gotten so good at hiding it. Let's talk about what's actually going on in your brain when this happens. When you have ADHD, your brain processes emotional information differently than neurotypical brains. The emotional regulation centers in your prefrontal cortex, the part that's supposed to help you pause and evaluate whether a situation is actually threatening. Don't communicate as effectively with the parts of your brain that generate emotional responses. So when something happens that your brain interprets as rejection, even the smallest thing, your amygdala fires off alarm signals without that regulatory check that would normally help you assess whether the threat is real or proportionate. The result is an emotional reaction that feels absolutely overwhelming and completely out of your control. You're not choosing to feel devastated when your boss says they want to review your work. You're not deciding to spiral into despair when a friend doesn't respond to your text for 3 hours. Your brain is genuinely experiencing these situations as existential threats to your social survival, and it's reacting accordingly. The thing that makes rejection-sensitive dysphoria so incredibly difficult to live with is that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if the rejection is real or imagined, major or minor, from someone who matters deeply to you or from a stranger you'll never see again. Your brain responds to all of it with the same level of intensity. You make a joke that doesn't land in a meeting and you feel the same crushing shame you'd feel if you'd been publicly humiliated. Someone scrolls past your social media post without liking it, and your brain tells you that you're unlikable and nobody cares about what you have to say. Your friend suggests a different restaurant than the one you recommended, and suddenly you're convinced they think your opinions are worthless. These responses aren't proportional to the situation, and you know that intellectually. But in the moment when that wave of emotional pain hits you, logic doesn't matter. The pain is real. The devastation is real. And the fact that you can't seem to control it makes you feel even worse about yourself. Here's where it gets really complicated. Because you've experienced this overwhelming emotional pain so many times, your brain has developed strategies to protect you from it. And some of those strategies end up causing even more problems in your life. You might become a perfectionist, not because you actually believe you can achieve perfection, but because if you can just do everything flawlessly, then maybe nobody will criticize you, and you won't have to feel that unbearable emotional pain. You spend hours agonizing over an email that should take 5 minutes to write because you're trying to craft it in a way that eliminates any possible chance of negative feedback. You rehearse conversations in your head dozens of times before having them, trying to anticipate every possible reaction and prepare the perfect response. You check and double-check and triple-check your work, not because you don't trust yourself, but because the thought of someone finding a mistake fills you with such intense dread that the extra time feels worth it. Or maybe you go in the opposite direction. Maybe you've developed a defensive shell where you reject others before they can reject you. You act like you don't care what people think. You cultivate an attitude of indifference or even hostility because if you can convince yourself that their opinions don't matter, then their rejection can't hurt you. You might sabotage relationships when they start getting close because the fear of eventual rejection is more painful than the loneliness of pushing people away first. You quit jobs before you can be fired, end relationships before you can be left, withdraw from friendships before they can fade away. You tell yourself you're protecting yourself, and in a way you are. But what you're really doing is living in a constant state of defensive anticipation, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, never allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to actually connect with anyone. And then there's the people-pleasing. Oh, the people-pleasing. You say yes when you mean no. You agree with opinions you don't share. You go along with plans you don't want to do. You suppress your own needs and preferences and desires because disagreeing with someone, setting a boundary, or prioritizing yourself feels like an invitation for rejection. And your brain has learned that rejection is something to be avoided at all costs. So you become a chameleon, constantly adjusting yourself to match what you think other people want from you. You become so focused on making sure nobody has a reason to reject you that you lose touch with who you actually are underneath all those adaptations. And here's the cruelest irony of all. The very strategies you use to protect yourself from rejection often end up creating the rejection you're trying to avoid. Your perfectionism makes you so slow and anxious that people get frustrated with you. Your defensive armor makes you seem cold or unapproachable. Your people-pleasing means that nobody really knows the real you, so they're connecting with a version of you that doesn't actually exist, and eventually that false connection crumbles. If this is hitting close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button, because we need to talk about how this pattern affects every area of your life, and most people suffering with this don't even realize there's a name for what they're experiencing. Let's talk about what this looks like in relationships, because this is where rejection-sensitive dysphoria does some of its most devastating work. You're dating someone, and things are going well, really well, better than they've gone with anyone in a long time. And then they do something small. They don't text you back as quickly as usual. They seem a little distracted when you're talking. They make an offhand comment that could be interpreted as criticism. And your brain immediately jumps to catastrophic conclusions. They're losing interest. They've realized you're not good enough. They're going to leave. The relationship is ending. You can feel it happening. And that feeling is so real, so visceral, so completely convincing that you start acting on it. Maybe you become clingy and anxious, constantly seeking reassurance, asking them if everything is okay, analyzing every word and gesture for signs of impending rejection. Or maybe you pull away, becoming cold and distant, building walls to protect yourself from the pain you're certain is coming. Either way, your partner is confused because from their perspective, nothing has changed. They were just having a busy day at work, or they were tired, or they made a thoughtless comment without any deeper meaning. But your reaction to your perceived rejection starts creating actual problems in the relationship. They feel overwhelmed by your need for reassurance or hurt by your sudden withdrawal. And the relationship that was actually fine starts developing real issues. This pattern repeats itself over and over. You meet someone new and you're excited and hopeful. But underneath that excitement is this constant background anxiety, this waiting for the moment when they'll see the real you and decide you're not worth the effort. So you work incredibly hard in the early stages of the relationship. You're attentive and accommodating and endlessly adaptable. You ignore red flags because you're so grateful that someone wants to be with you that you can't risk losing them by having standards or boundaries. You tolerate treatment that you shouldn't tolerate because the fear of being alone feels worse than the pain of being in an unhealthy relationship. And when conflicts arise, as they inevitably do in any relationship, you can't engage with them constructively because any disagreement feels like rejection. Your partner says they're upset about something you did, and you hear that they think you're a terrible person, and they're going to leave you. So instead of listening and trying to understand their perspective and working together to resolve the issue, you either become defensively angry, trying to protect yourself from the emotional pain of their criticism, or you collapse into shame and self-loathing, apologizing profusely and promising to change everything about yourself to make them happy. Your partner, if they're neurotypical, probably has no framework for understanding what's happening. They see your intense reactions to minor situations, and they think you're being manipulative or dramatic or unstable. They don't understand that you're not choosing to feel this way. that your nervous system is genuinely in crisis mode, that the emotional pain you're experiencing is as real as physical pain. So they might start walking on eggshells around you, carefully managing their words and actions to avoid triggering these reactions, which just confirms your deepest fear that you're too much, too difficult, too broken to be in a relationship with. Or they might get frustrated and tell you that you're overreacting, that you need to calm down, that you're making everything about you, which triggers even more intense feelings of rejection and shame. The relationship becomes a minefield, where both of you are trying to navigate around explosions that one of you can see coming and the other can't, and eventually the strain of it becomes too much. Here's what makes this particularly painful. You know on some level that your reactions are disproportionate. You can see yourself spiraling and you hate it. You don't want to be this way. You don't want to put this pressure on your relationships. You don't want to feel this level of emotional pain over situations that you intellectually know aren't actually threatening. But knowing that doesn't give you the ability to stop it. Your partner says something innocuous, and before you can even process it consciously, your body is already responding. Your heart rate spikes, your stomach drops, your thoughts start racing down familiar catastrophic pathways, and by the time your logical brain catches up and says, "Wait, that's not what they meant," the emotional reaction is already in full swing and you're trying to manage a crisis while simultaneously trying to hide the fact that you're having a crisis because you're ashamed of having these reactions in the first place. Now let's talk about how this shows up in your work life, because this is where rejection-sensitive dysphoria can seriously derail your career without anyone, including you, understanding why. You're in a meeting and you present an idea. Your manager or a coworker offers a critique or suggests a different approach. And intellectually, you know that this is normal workplace communication, that feedback is part of collaboration, that disagreement doesn't mean personal rejection. But your nervous system doesn't know that. In the moment when they push back on your idea, your brain interprets it as a fundamental rejection of you as a person, and you feel that same crushing wave of shame and inadequacy. So what do? Maybe you shut down. You stop contributing ideas in meetings because the risk of having them criticized feels unbearable. You volunteer for projects where you can work alone because collaboration means exposing yourself to feedback. You become that person who's capable and talented, but mysteriously underperforms, not because you lack skills, but because you're so afraid of doing something imperfectly and facing criticism that you'd rather not try at all. Or maybe you overcompensate in the other direction. You become defensive when anyone questions your work. You take constructive feedback as personal attacks. You argue and justify and explain at length, trying to make people understand that you didn't make a mistake, that there was a good reason for every choice you made, that they're wrong to criticize you. Your coworkers and managers start seeing you as difficult to work with, resistant to feedback, unable to collaborate effectively. They don't understand that underneath your defensiveness is a person in genuine emotional pain, someone whose nervous system is genuinely screaming danger signals. They just see someone who can't take criticism professionally, and that perception affects your opportunities for advancement, your relationships with colleagues, your entire career trajectory. And then there's email. Let's talk about email and written communication at work, because this is where rejection-sensitive dysphoria can eat hours and hours of your day. You need to send a straightforward email asking a coworker for information. It should take 2 minutes, but you spend 20 minutes crafting it, reading it over and over, adjusting the tone, adding qualifiers and apologies and expressions of gratitude, trying to make absolutely certain that there's no possible way the person could interpret it negatively. You're not just communicating information, you're trying to preemptively manage their emotional response to protect yourself from potential rejection. You send the email, and then you obsess over it. Did you sound too demanding? Too apologetic? Too casual? Too formal? When they don't respond immediately, you start catastrophizing. They're annoyed with you. They think you're incompetent. They're complaining about you to other people. You check your inbox compulsively, And when they finally do respond with a perfectly normal, "Sure, here's that information," you feel a wave of relief that's completely disproportionate to the situation, followed immediately by exhaustion because you just put yourself through an emotional ringer over a routine work communication. Performance reviews are particularly brutal. Even when they're positive, even when your manager is literally telling you that you're doing great work, your brain latches onto any suggestion for improvement, any area identified for growth, and interprets it as evidence that you're failing, that you're not good enough, that you're about to be fired. You leave the review feeling devastated while your manager thinks they just had a productive conversation about your professional development. And if the review contains any actual criticism, even mild, even constructive, even delivered kindly, you might spend days or weeks in a shame spiral, convinced that you're terrible at your job, that everyone knows it, that you're fooling nobody, and it's only a matter of time before they realize they made a mistake in hiring you. Subscribe to this channel if you want more truth about how ADHD actually affects your daily life, because what I'm about to tell you next about how rejection-sensitive dysphoria shapes your sense of identity is something most therapists won't even address. The really insidious thing about living with rejection-sensitive dysphoria for years or decades is what it does to your fundamental sense of self. When you've spent your entire life experiencing emotional pain that others tell you is disproportionate, when you've been told over and over that you're too sensitive, that you're overreacting, that you need to develop thicker skin, you internalize a message that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Not just that you have a neurological difference that causes you to process rejection differently, but that you are, at your core, defective. Too much, too needy, too emotional, too difficult. You start to believe that your emotional responses are character flaws rather than neurological realities, and that belief shapes everything about how you move through the world. You become hypervigilant to signs of rejection in every interaction. Someone's tone shifts slightly, and you're immediately analyzing what you might have done wrong. A conversation ends abruptly, and you replay it in your mind for hours, looking for the moment you said something that made them want to get away from you. People laugh nearby, and your first thought is that they're laughing at you. Someone seems distracted when you're talking, and you conclude that you're boring, that nobody really wants to hear what you have to say, that you should just stop talking altogether. You're constantly scanning your environment for threats of rejection, and because you're looking for them, you find them everywhere, even when they're not actually there. Your brain becomes a rejection detection machine, and it has an incredibly sensitive trigger. This hypervigilance is exhausting. You're never at rest. You're never secure in your relationships because you're always waiting for the other person to realize you're not worth the effort. You're never confident in your achievements because you're always bracing for someone to point out your failures. You can't enjoy success because you're too busy worrying about the inevitable criticism or the moment when people realize you don't deserve the success you've achieved. You live in a constant state of defensive readiness, armor always up, walls always built, never fully relaxing into any situation, because relaxing means being vulnerable, and vulnerability means the rejection. When it comes, we'll hurt even more. And here's where it gets really complicated in terms of identity. Because you've spent so much energy trying to avoid rejection, you've probably built a version of yourself that you think is acceptable to others. You've learned to suppress the parts of yourself that have been rejected in the past. You've developed an external persona that's designed to be palatable, non-threatening, easy to like. If your enthusiasm has been met with eye rolls or annoyance, you've learned to tamp it down, to be more measured, to not show how excited you really are about things. If your opinions have been dismissed or argued against, you've learned to keep them to yourself or only share them tentatively, with lots of qualifiers and escape routes built in. If your needs have been seen as too demanding, you've learned to minimize them, to be low maintenance, to ask for as little as possible. The problem is that this acceptable version of yourself isn't actually you. It's a carefully constructed mask designed to protect you from rejection. But wearing it all the time means that nobody, including you, really knows who you are underneath it. You've spent so long adapting to what you think others want that you've lost touch with what you actually want, what you actually feel, what you actually think about things. When someone asks you a simple question like what kind of food you want, or what movie you'd like to watch, you might genuinely not know the answer because you're so used to calibrating your preferences to match other people's that you've stopped checking in with your own desires altogether. You've become a collection of adaptations rather than a coherent self, and that creates this strange existential emptiness where you're surrounded by people but feel fundamentally alone because none of them know the real you, and you're not even sure the real you exists anymore. Let's talk about what happens with friendships, because this is an area where rejection-sensitive dysphoria operates in ways that are particularly painful and particularly misunderstood. You have a friend, someone you care about, someone you enjoy spending time with, and then something shifts. Maybe they cancel plans, maybe they don't respond to a text as quickly as usual. Maybe they post on social media about hanging out with other people and they didn't invite you. And your brain immediately constructs a narrative. They're pulling away. They've realized they don't actually like you that much. They were just being polite this whole time, but now they're done pretending. You've been too much, too intense, too needy, and they're distancing themselves. This narrative feels absolutely true. You can feel it in your body. You can see the evidence everywhere you look. So you start pulling back. You stop reaching out because you don't want to be that person who doesn't get the hint that they're not wanted. You don't want to impose on someone who clearly doesn't value your friendship. When they do reach out, you're a little distant, a little guarded, because you're protecting yourself from the hurt of their inevitable rejection. And from your friend's perspective, from the outside, it looks like you're the one pulling away. They have no idea that you're in an emotional crisis over the friendship potentially ending. They don't know that you've interpreted their completely normal life happening to them as a statement about your worth. So they match your energy. You pull back, so they pull back. You're distant, so they're distant. And the friendship that was actually fine starts to deteriorate because one person is reacting to a rejection that hasn't actually happened, and the other person is confused and possibly hurt by the sudden change in dynamic. Or maybe you go in the opposite direction. Maybe when you sense that shift, real or imagined, you become more invested in the friendship. You reach out more. You try harder. You become more available, more accommodating, more willing to drop everything when they need something. You're trying to prove your value, trying to demonstrate that you're worth keeping around, trying to prevent the abandonment you feel coming. But this increased intensity can actually push the person away. They feel pressure they don't understand. They feel like you need more from the friendship than they're able to give. They start to actually create some distance, not because they don't like you, but because the dynamic has become uncomfortable. And now the rejection you were afraid of becomes real, a self-fulfilling prophecy born from your attempt to prevent it. Friendships also suffer because rejection-sensitive dysphoria makes conflict nearly impossible to navigate. In any friendship, there are going to be moments of disappointment, misunderstanding, or hurt feelings. Healthy friendships work through these moments. Someone says something thoughtless, the other person expresses that it hurt them. They talk about it, they repair the connection, and move forward. But when you have rejection-sensitive dysphoria, you can't engage with conflict in this healthy way. If your friend does something that hurts you, you might not be able to tell them because bringing it up feels like you're inviting them to reject you entirely. It feels safer to just absorb the hurt than to risk the conversation that might end with them deciding you're too difficult and walking away. So you build up resentment over time, small hurts accumulating into bigger wounds, and the friendship erodes from the inside while on the surface everything looks fine. And if your friend brings up something you did that hurt them, you can't hear it as the healthy communication it actually is. You hear it as total rejection. They're telling you that you're a bad friend, that you've failed, that you've damaged the relationship irreparably. So you either become defensively angry, unable to sit with the discomfort of having hurt someone because the shame is too overwhelming, or you collapse into self-loathing and apologize so profusely and beat yourself up so thoroughly that your friend ends up comforting you instead of you actually hearing and addressing their concern. Either way, the actual issue doesn't get resolved. The friendship doesn't get stronger through successfully navigating conflict. Instead, you both learn that bringing up problems is too fraught and too painful, so you stop doing it, and the friendship becomes more superficial to avoid the danger zone of authentic communication. Here's something that nobody talks about with rejection-sensitive dysphoria. It doesn't just make you fear rejection from others, it makes you reject yourself. Every time you have an emotional reaction that feels disproportionate, every time you spiral into anxiety over something small, every time you need reassurance or struggle to regulate your response to criticism, you judge yourself harshly for it. You reject your own emotional reality. You tell yourself you're being ridiculous, that you're too sensitive, that you need to get over it, that there's something wrong with you. And this self-rejection is just as painful as external rejection, maybe more so, because you can't get away from it. You carry it with you constantly. You're both the person experiencing overwhelming emotional pain and the person criticizing yourself for experiencing it. And that creates this internal civil war, where no matter what you do, some part of you is going to be disappointed. This self-rejection makes it nearly impossible to develop self-compassion, which is actually one of the most effective tools for managing rejection-sensitive dysphoria. When you're in the middle of a RSD episode, when you're feeling that crushing emotional pain, what you need is to be able to say to yourself, "This is really hard and it's okay that I'm struggling with it." But instead you say, "I shouldn't be feeling this way, there's something wrong with me for feeling this way. I need to stop feeling this way immediately." And that judgment amplifies the pain rather than soothing it. You're not just dealing with the initial rejection, real or perceived. You're also dealing with your own internal rejection of your response to it, and that secondary pain often ends up being worse than the primary pain. Let me tell you about what happens with special interests and hobbies, because this is an area where rejection-sensitive dysphoria intersects with ADHD in particularly painful ways. You find something you're passionate about. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe it's a subject you want to learn about. Maybe it's a creative project. And that passion feels amazing. For the first time in a while, your brain is engaged and excited and focused. You want to talk about it, share it, involve others in it. So you do. You bring it up in conversation with friends or family or your partner, and you watch their reaction carefully, probably more carefully than you realize. If they seem interested and engaged, you feel validated and you lean into the interest more. But if they seem bored or dismissive, or they make a joke about you being obsessed, or they change the subject quickly, you feel that familiar crushing wave of rejection. The message your brain receives is that this thing you care about, and by extension you yourself, is too much, too intense, not interesting to others, something to be embarrassed about. So you stop sharing it. You pursue your interest in private, in secret almost, because you've learned that exposing your genuine enthusiasm opens you up to rejection. You spend hours on your hobby or learning about your subject of interest, but you never mention it to anyone, because you don't want to see that look on their faces again, that slightly glazed-over expression that says they're just tolerating your enthusiasm rather than sharing it. And this creates a fundamental loneliness, because the things that bring you the most joy are things you can't share with the people in your life. You're editing yourself constantly, presenting a version that's more palatable but less authentic, and over time you start to feel like your real interests and passions are shameful secrets that need to be hidden. Sometimes the rejection comes in more subtle forms. Your partner or friend does listen when you talk about your interest, but they don't engage with it at the level you want them to. They don't ask follow-up questions. They don't remember details you've shared. They're present but not really present, and you can feel the difference. And that mild lack of enthusiasm feels like rejection too. Your brain interprets it as evidence that what you care about doesn't matter to them, which means some essential part of you doesn't matter to them. So you scale back your sharing even more, becoming more and more isolated with the things that actually light you up inside. Or maybe you've experienced outright mockery or criticism of your interests. Someone calls your hobby childish or weird or a waste of time. Someone makes fun of how much you know about a particular subject. Someone rolls their eyes when you get excited and start talking fast about something you're passionate about. These moments of open rejection can be so painful that they shape your relationship with your interests for years afterward. You might abandon interests altogether rather than risk that kind of ridicule again. You might force yourself to develop interests that seem more socially acceptable, even though they don't genuinely engage you, because acceptability feels safer than authenticity. Drop a comment below if you've ever abandoned something you loved because someone made you feel stupid for caring about it, because I want you to know how common this experience is and how much it reveals about what we're actually dealing with here. The intersection of rejection, sensitive dysphoria, and masculine expectations creates a particularly toxic combination that most people never talk about. As a man, you're operating in a cultural context that already tells you that emotional sensitivity is weakness, that having feelings that affect you strongly means you're not properly masculine, that you should be able to brush off criticism and rejection without it bothering you. But your nervous system is wired to experience rejection as intensely painful as a genuine crisis. So you're stuck between your neurological reality and your cultural expectations, and there's no way to reconcile them. You feel these intense emotions, but you've been taught that feeling them makes you less of a man, so you hide them, suppress them, shame yourself for having them. This creates layers of additional pain. You're not just dealing with the rejection-sensitive dysphoria itself. You're also dealing with shame about having rejection-sensitive dysphoria, because it doesn't fit with how you think men are supposed to be. When you feel devastated by criticism, you might push that feeling down and replace it with anger, because anger is a more masculine, acceptable emotion. So you go through life appearing defensive and hostile when what you're actually feeling is hurt and vulnerable. People see the anger and they respond to the anger, which creates more rejection, which creates more hurt that gets channeled into more anger. The cycle perpetuates itself, and you become increasingly isolated from your own emotional reality and from genuine connection with others. Or maybe you go in the direction of emotional shutdown. You've learned that feeling things intensely is dangerous and unmanly, so you develop strategies to not feel much of anything at all. You intellectualize everything. You stay in your head. You avoid situations that might trigger strong emotions. You keep relationships at a distance where they can't hurt you. People perceive you as cold or detached, when what you're actually doing is protecting yourself from emotional pain that you've been taught you're not allowed to feel or express. And this shutdown has consequences. You lose access to positive emotions along with the negative ones. You can't be vulnerable with your partner because vulnerability might lead to rejection, and you can't handle the rejection. You can't be fully present with your kids because presence requires emotional openness, and emotional openness is too risky. You go through life at a remove, watching yourself live rather than actually living, because actual living means actual feeling, and actual feeling means actual pain. The masculine expectation of stoicism and invulnerability also means that when you do reach out for help with rejection-sensitive dysphoria, you're often not taken seriously. You try to explain to someone that criticism or rejection affects you more intensely than it seems to affect other people, and they tell you to toughen up, to not take things so personally, to develop thicker skin. They treat your neurological reality as a character weakness that you should be able to overcome through sheer willpower and mental fortitude. And every time someone responds to your genuine struggle with these kinds of dismissals, it confirms your fear that there's something wrong with you, that you're failing at basic masculinity, that you're weak in a way that men aren't supposed to be weak. This is particularly painful if you had a father or male role models who embodied the stoic masculine ideal. You watch them brush off criticism that would have devastated you. You watch them handle rejection with apparent ease. You watch them move through the world with a confidence that you couldn't even imagine feeling, and you internalize the message that this is what men are supposed to be like. The fact that you're not like that means you're defective. You're not measuring up. You're not a real man in some fundamental way. And that becomes another source of shame that you carry with you, another way that you feel like you're failing at basic human functioning. Let's talk about what happens in high-stress situations, because this is where rejection-sensitive dysphoria can become genuinely dangerous to your mental health. You're already dealing with life stress. Maybe work is demanding. Maybe there's relationship tension. Maybe you're dealing with financial pressure. Maybe you're going through a major life transition. Your nervous system is already running at capacity just managing the regular demands of your life. And then something happens that triggers rejection-sensitive dysphoria. It doesn't even have to be big. Your boss asks to see you in their office. Your partner seems distant. A friend doesn't respond to your invitation to hang out. And that trigger, on top of everything else you're managing, pushes you over the edge. Suddenly, you're not just feeling emotional pain about this one situation. You're feeling the accumulated weight of every rejection you've ever experienced. Your brain starts catastrophizing not just about the current situation, but about everything. Your job is unstable. Your relationship is failing. Your friendships are dissolving. You're going to end up alone and unemployed, and you have nothing, and you are nothing. The thoughts spiral faster than you can counter them. The emotional pain becomes so intense that you start having physical symptoms. Your chest tightens. You can't catch your breath. You feel nauseous. You might have a panic attack. You might have intrusive thoughts about escape, about just disappearing, about not existing anymore because existing hurts too much. This is the part where rejection-sensitive dysphoria can slide into something that looks like depression or anxiety, and often it is comorbid with those conditions. But it's important to understand that there's a specific trigger. This isn't just generalized depression or anxiety. This is a response to rejection, real or perceived, that becomes so overwhelming that your brain starts shutting down to protect you from the pain. You might find yourself unable to function. You can't work, can't engage with people, can't do basic tasks because all your mental and emotional resources are consumed by managing this internal crisis that nobody else can see. And here's what makes this particularly isolating. When you try to explain to someone what's happening, when you try to tell them that you're in genuine crisis because of something that seems minor to them, they often don't understand. Your partner doesn't understand why their distracted response to your story has sent you into a spiral. Your friend doesn't understand why their canceled plans have made you convinced they hate you. Your family doesn't understand why you're devastated by criticism that they think was mild and constructive. So you stop trying to explain. You manage these crises alone. You hide the severity of what you're feeling because you've learned that revealing it just leads to more rejection, more evidence that you're too much, too difficult, too broken to deserve support. The most dangerous thing about these high-intensity RSD episodes is that they can make you feel like the pain will never end. In the moment when you're experiencing it, you can't imagine feeling any other way. The pain is so all-consuming that your brain genuinely starts to believe that this is your permanent state, that you'll always feel this devastated, this hopeless, this alone. And when you're in that mental state, when escape from the pain feels impossible, that's when the darkest thoughts can emerge. That's when you might start thinking about ways to make the pain stop permanently. This is why rejection-sensitive dysphoria needs to be taken seriously, not dismissed as oversensitivity or attention-seeking. This is a neurological reality that can have genuine mental health consequences if it's not understood and addressed. I need you to hear this clearly. If you're experiencing rejection-sensitive dysphoria at a level where you're having thoughts about harming yourself or escaping the pain permanently, that's a sign that you need professional help immediately. This isn't something you should try to manage alone. There are therapists who understand ADHD and rejection-sensitive dysphoria. There are medications that can help regulate the emotional intensity. There are strategies and tools that can make this more manageable. But you have to reach out. You have to tell someone what you're actually experiencing, not the minimized version you usually present. but the real depth of the pain. And I know that's terrifying because it means being vulnerable, and vulnerability means risking rejection. But staying silent and suffering alone is more dangerous than the risk of reaching out. Let's talk about what helps. Because understanding rejection-sensitive dysphoria is important, but it's not enough. You need to know what you can actually do about it. First thing, and this is crucial, you need to understand that this is neurological. This isn't a character flaw. This isn't you being weak or overly sensitive. This is your brain processing rejection differently because of how ADHD affects your emotional regulation systems. That understanding doesn't make the pain go away, but it changes how you relate to it. Instead of adding shame and self-judgment on top of the pain, you can recognize that you're dealing with a neurological reality that's not your fault. You're not broken. Your brain is just wired differently, and that wiring comes with specific challenges. The second thing is learning to create space between the trigger and your response. This is incredibly difficult, but it's also incredibly important. When something happens that your brain interprets as rejection, there's usually a moment, sometimes a fraction of a second, before the emotional cascade fully takes over. If you can catch yourself in that moment and insert even the smallest pause, you give your logical brain a chance to evaluate the situation before your emotional brain takes complete control. That might look like taking 3 deep breaths before responding to a text that triggered you. It might look like excusing yourself from a conversation to go to the bathroom and giving yourself 2 minutes to regulate before continuing. It might look like sitting with the feeling for 60 seconds and asking yourself whether there's any other interpretation of what just happened besides the catastrophic one your brain is offering you. The third thing is developing what therapists call distress tolerance skills. These are techniques specifically designed to help you manage overwhelming emotional pain when it hits. Things like holding ice cubes in your hands to create an intense physical sensation that interrupts the emotional spiral, doing intensive exercise to burn off the adrenaline and cortisol flooding your system, using the 5 senses grounding technique where you identify 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. These aren't cures. They're not going to make the rejection-sensitive dysphoria go away. But they can help you survive the acute phase of an episode without doing something destructive or letting the spiral take you completely down. The fourth thing is building what I call a reality testing team. These are people in your life who understand rejection, sensitive dysphoria, and who can help you evaluate whether your interpretation of a situation is accurate. When you're convinced that your partner is about to leave you because they seem distracted during dinner, you can text your reality testing person and say, "My brain is telling me X is happening. Can you help me reality check this?" And they can help you consider alternative explanations, remind you of contradictory evidence, or validate that yes, something did seem off and it's worth having a direct conversation about rather than catastrophizing alone. This requires vulnerability, requires admitting to someone that you need this kind of help, but it can literally save you hours or days of unnecessary suffering. The fifth thing is getting really precise with your language when you communicate with others about what you need. Instead of trying to hide your rejection-sensitive dysphoria or hoping people will magically understand it, you can actually explain it directly. You can tell your partner, "I have this neurological thing where criticism or perceived rejection triggers an intense emotional response that's often disproportionate to the situation. I'm working on managing it, but it helps me if you're really direct and clear when you communicate, especially about anything negative, because ambiguity makes my brain catastrophize." You can tell your boss, "I take feedback really seriously, sometimes too seriously, so I've found it helpful when people balance constructive criticism with specific acknowledgement of what I'm doing well." You're not asking people to walk on eggshells. You're giving them information that helps them communicate with you in a way that works better for your nervous system. The sixth thing, and this is big, is potentially considering medication. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria, often responds to certain medications commonly used for ADHD, or anxiety, or emotional regulation. Stimulant medications can help by improving the connection between your emotional regulation centers and the rest of your brain. Alpha agonists like guanfacine or clonidine can reduce the intensity of emotional responses. SSRIs can help stabilize mood and reduce the frequency of intense episodes. I'm not a doctor. I can't prescribe anything, but I'm telling you that medication is a legitimate option worth discussing with a psychiatrist who understands ADHD and RSD. This isn't something you should just tough your way through if there are pharmaceutical tools that could significantly improve your quality of life. The seventh thing is therapy, specifically with someone who understands ADHD and rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Regular cognitive behavioral therapy can help you identify and challenge the catastrophic thought patterns that fuel RSD episodes. Dialectical behavior therapy has specific modules on emotional regulation and distress tolerance that are incredibly useful. ADHD coaching can help you build systems and structures that reduce your exposure to situations that commonly trigger RSD. The key is finding someone who actually gets it, who doesn't dismiss your experiences as oversensitivity, who understands the neurological basis for what you're dealing with. But here's what nobody tells you about managing rejection-sensitive dysphoria. All of these strategies and tools and techniques, they help. They genuinely do, but they don't make it go away completely. You're always going to have to work harder than neurotypical people to manage emotional responses to rejection and criticism. You're always going to experience these situations more intensely, and that's not fair, and it's exhausting, and some days you're going to be really angry about having to do all this extra emotional labor just to function in situations that other people navigate without even thinking about it. That anger is legitimate. That frustration is valid. You're allowed to feel it. What you need to understand is that rejection-sensitive dysphoria doesn't mean you're doomed to a life of emotional pain and damaged relationships. It means you have a specific challenge that requires specific strategies. Plenty of people with ADHD and RSD build successful careers, maintain healthy relationships, develop strong friendships, and live fulfilling lives. But they do it by understanding what they're dealing with, by building the right support systems, by developing the right tools, and by being honest with themselves and others about what they need. They stop trying to be like neurotypical people and start working with their actual neurology instead of against it. The thing I want you to walk away from this understanding is that your emotional intensity isn't a bug, it's a feature. Yes, it makes rejection more painful, but it also makes connection more meaningful. It makes success more joyful. It makes passion more engaging. The same neurological difference that causes you to feel rejection so deeply is also what allows you to care so deeply, to love so deeply, to commit so deeply to the things and people that matter to you. Neurotypical people don't feel things with the intensity you do, and that means they miss out on some of the richness of experience that's available to you when you're not in crisis mode. The goal isn't to become less sensitive. The goal is to develop the skills and support systems that let you experience your sensitivity as a strength, rather than a constant source of pain. Your nervous system isn't broken. It's just different. And different requires different strategies, but it doesn't require shame. It doesn't require hiding. It doesn't require pretending to be something you're not. What it requires is understanding, compassion, the right tools, and the courage to keep showing up as yourself even when that feels risky. That's what managing rejection-sensitive dysphoria actually looks like, and you're capable of it even when it doesn't feel like you are.